This lecture is part of a series of lectures on the teaching of writing, particularly in units of work you're doing with students in the senior years around teaching texts towards an assessment that's a text response essay. So text is central to the English classroom, and the focus of this lecture is work we do in English classrooms with and around texts that are studied as literature. I've been thinking about this lecture and wondering about the place of text study and writing essays on texts in the current climate. Sometimes as English teachers, it can feel like our work with texts and writing text response essays of various kinds is remote from the pressing concerns we face as a society. The summer's bushfires presented us with an existential threat, bringing home the very real effects of climate change on our way of life. And sometimes events such as these can dwarf or feel like it dwarfs the kind of work we might do with literary texts in our classroom. In addition to the immediate crisis of the bushfires, we can consider the place of literacy and literacy practices in relation to current issues. Seen here are two responses to the bushfires and climate change that, on first glance, seem to have not much to do with the business of studying literature and writing text response essays. However, if we see the study of texts as part of a broader ecology of work with and around language and issues of representation and struggles over meaning, then we can locate the work we do in this part of our curriculum in relation to the ongoing contest over the meanings and values of our wider society. These images before you represent interventions made by people authoring meaning in the shared, ongoing struggle over the meanings and values we live by and the directions we take as a community. So what's text response got to do with that? The importance of coming up with an interpretation, your own informed take on a text, is a practice that is connected to the task of working out the meanings that are important to you in your own life and what you think about the texts and viewpoints that make a claim on you. In our society, we are surrounded by ready-made or pre-made meanings that we are asked to take on as our own. And we may indeed take them on. But text study gives us an opportunity to provide students with the experience of sifting through other people's interpretations of a text in the process of coming up with their own interpretation. This experience seems important from the point of view of developing student voice. This does not necessarily mean that we expect our students to come up with a completely original take on a text that we're studying with them. But it does mean that the student reader needs to have an experience of coming up with a reading of a text that at least partly comes from them and their own thinking, done alone and in collaboration with others. We address this democratic aspect of literacy most directly in our curriculum in the using language to persuade aspects of courses of study. But the experience of coming up with an interpretation of a literary text or film and formulating a response to a text is another way in which we foster important skills for running your own life and having a voice in the field of competing interpretations. It gives young people practice in taking up a voice and developing a text in a world of texts and voices. The study of literature can be seen as part of a broader, ongoing conversation about perennial issues in which text study is connected to other textual practices. Before going into talking about teaching texts and essays in the classroom, I want to zoom out a bit and take a different perspective. The text response essay and the study of text as literature can be seen to occur in a broader context of the role of non-fiction writing in our culture. Non-fiction writing has been enjoying increased popularity over the past 15 or so years in long-form journalistic narratives and research. Indeed, it is now possible to study long-form journalism in English classes, as happens with Stasiland by Anna Funder and The Tall Man by Chloe Hooper. The essay In the Wild, so to speak, in the world beyond school, also enjoys significant popularity and influence. It is clear from the success of these publications and subscription and content curation services such as long form and long reads, that there is an appetite for long form non-fiction prose that investigates current issues from a range of viewpoints. Some of this work is polemic, while other work is more investigative or literary. If we think of our teaching of the essay form to our students in relation to the life of essays in the world at large, this gives us a clue as to why it has a place in the English curriculum and how we might go about teaching it. So I wanted to start with a broader context for essay writing in our culture, because the essay has evolved as a text that allows the writer to do certain things. Starting from the idea of what an essay allows a writer to do can be a good way of thinking about how to go about teaching it. Structure is important, but only insofar as students need a scaffold to work with as they learn their way around analytic expository prose and achieve the purpose of the form. Some students outgrow this structure in the course of developing their writing, and this is to be expected in a genre that is actually quite loose in its structure in the world of non-fiction writing at large. Structures can be both enabling and constraining, and this is a tension we will explore throughout this lecture. A friend of mine, with whom I taught academic and professional writing at Monash many years ago, described the essay as a machine for thinking, and I think this is a very apt description. The essay is a text form that allows a writer to advance a contention and outline the reasoning and evidence in support of that contention. In a text-response essay, the contention is a well-developed interpretation of the meanings and significance of a work, and to explain how the features of that work suggest these meanings. There may also be attention paid to the historical and social conditions that the work is addressing, including an address to other texts. Linking this process to Terry Locke's 4 orientations, the ideas I'm sharing with you in this lecture range across all 4 quadrants of his model. Ultimately, we want students to have what he calls pragmatic competence in essay writing, which may mean understanding what an essay is designed to do and how the features of an essay help a writer achieve those aims. However, as Michael Klein points out in his essay, Writing, Testing and Culture, in the readings, it's not a neutral genre. This is a genre that has evolved in particular ways in particular language groups. And so the English language essay is linear and really values linear thinking, whereas in the essay in other languages is structured differently to value different thinking. So even within school writing, the essay has many guises. There's the text response essay, there's the expository essay, the persuasive essay, a comparative essay, a language analysis essay, a VCE literature passage analysis essay, and if you're in a school teaching IB English, they will have essays such as literary commentary and a literary comparative essay. Each one has a slightly different purpose. For the purposes of this lecture, I will be focusing on work we do with texts with a view towards students developing a rich interpretation of that text or texts and presenting that interpretation in a text response essay. In Victoria, this aspect of the curriculum is often called reading and responding. The teaching of writing is shaped by your context, and this includes a number of factors. It's shaped by your setting, the school setting, the background, your own values, your own education. Even teaching a text type seen as generic, such as the academic essay, is framed by those circumstances and particularities of context. It's informed by curriculum and assessment documents that change from year to year. So as study designs change for VCE, so do the kinds of essays that are being assessed. The text response is fairly perennial, but recently there's been the introduction of the comparative text response, which now means that that form is taught extensively in schools. So the process of teaching text response is a negotiation between your stance as an educator, the student's needs, the study designs, the assessment rubrics, the community expectations, and the discourse and structures and conventions of the form. And all of this is being negotiated and navigated as you make your way through a unit of work. So these are the key words for where we're going to now. negotiation, interpretation, meaning, and language, specifically the disciplinary languages of literary criticism. At this point, I'm inviting you to perhaps pause this lecture at this point and say what you think in response to these questions, perhaps jotting a few ideas down. What makes an essay? So for a text to be an essay, what does it have to have in it? What are the features of an essay? By what criteria do we judge essays excellent, good, or poor? And crucially, where do your ideas about essay writing come from? Do they come from your education? Do they come from your own studies? Do they come from other teachers? Do they come from books you've read, essayists you've enjoyed, and so on? So I invite you to pause the lecture at this point and jot down your ideas in response to this. So hopefully at this point you've got on paper some of your ideas about what makes an essay and where you get those ideas from. This is part of your stance as an educator around this textual form. The reality is, of course, that you're spending a lot of your time as an educator grading children's essays or students' essays. While English teachers spend a great deal of time grading essays and ranking students, what I hope you've gathered by now is that there are approaches we can take to the teaching of text response that are focused on the development of student voice and the confidence to have their own ideas in response to texts. So, we do make explicit the qualities of analysis and writing that are rewarded in our examination systems. But we also develop practices that support student thinking and work with texts. A key idea from this lecture is that much of the work around essay writing happens around helping students to have ideas about texts so that they have something genuine to say in their essays. So structure is important, but having something to say is perhaps at least as important. One of the ways of thinking about an essay as a machine for thinking and sharing thoughts with an interested reader means that you're engaging with the skills involved in doing that. A lot of the features of engaging essay have become ossified in rules and formulae promoted in English classrooms. So the question is, how do we promote pragmatic competence with non-fiction and essayistic writing in our students, while also helping them make it their own and feeling empowered to go beyond the rules and formulae that we introduce them to as something to hang on to while they're learning how to write? And Terry Locke talks about this in his essay that we engaged with, where he looks at the 4 quadrants, the 4 orientations, and he says, at its worst, this promotes a decontextualised knowledge about language and the acquisition of grammatical skills based on a narrow and formulaic definitions of correctness. On the one hand, such an emphasis can also mean valuing the mastery of forms and conventions of a range of genres deemed to be socially significant, an approach which is related to but significantly different from the linguistic table manners promoted by traditional grammar. So attention for us as practitioners is helping students gain skills, pragmatic competence, while also allowing them to move beyond formula and narrow definitions of good writing. For many English teachers, helping their students become confident essay writers is a social justice issue. They want their students to have access to the forms of non-fiction writing that are highly prized in our culture. How do we do this while also acknowledging that the essay, as it is taught nowadays, is not a neutral genre, but comes from a culture that values particular things in writing, such as linearity and clarity, that may not be valued in other languages, places, and times? How do we help our students become competent users of the school essay? And what link does this have to become powerfully literate? And this is also indicated in a reading we looked at earlier in our time together from Bella Aleska, where she talks about her own parents' desire for her to have access to the culture of the dominant class, which meant being literate in the conventions of the genres of that language group. Teaching the text response essay is framed by the curriculum and assessment systems that you are working with. In many schools, there's a close alignment between the forms of essay writing assessed in the matriculation programs and what is taught further down in the school. English teachers need to be savvy about what is rewarded in examination systems so that they can help their students navigate the demands of those systems and access the opportunities that can result from a successful Year 12. So there is a social justice argument for making the linguistic features of essay writing explicit to students so that students can make choices about how they are going to take up those linguistic resources in their own writing. Nonetheless, if writing text response essays is going to have a genuine connection to what a student thinks about a text, there needs to be room for the students to bring who they are and their own ideas into the process. And this tension is very evident in the examiner's comments. Fairly typical, they're from a few years ago, but they're fairly typical of examiners' comments on performance of students in exams. So VCE examiners had the following to say about the text response section of the exam a few years ago. They argued for the value of close textual knowledge and careful management of response structure. There seems to be a dependence on formulaic, prepared responses by some students. A personal engagement with the text and ideas is neither formulaic nor predictable. Development in the writing of a coherent and effective discussion in response to the task, which is the question. Controlled use of language. The most successful pieces were thoughtful and fresh. Clear introductions, appropriate paragraphing, and the ability to embed quotations. So it's really evident. We can see here a mixture of agendas. There's the skills agenda. There's the idea that there are conventions of the genre of text response that examiners are looking for. There's also a clear message that a reliance on structure and formula may hold some students back from being as fresh and as innovative in their writing as they could be. We see a similar tension in the IB examiners' reports. So just touch on them quickly because some schools run the IB and they say similar things. There is always a tension between somewhat formulaic approaches to structure and an approach that might be less predictable and possibly more engaging to read. Writing about literature using an appropriate register and a sense of organisation and logic. Structure is something we all teach, but candidates should be encouraged to explore independently. Teach students to plan responses, a clear line of reasoning, argument and development. A spark of insight and analytic grit. Again, we've got this admixture of wanting certain things, looking for certain generic conventions, but rewarding ultimately students who are able to move beyond them in some way. So this is the tension that we navigate if we're teaching senior English classes and preparing students to write text response essays. The rest of this lecture is about strategies to support students in developing an interpretation of a text, because that's where that freshness and ability to move through a text and a text response confidently comes from, is this rich interpretation that students have been allowed to build up in your class. So before an essay can be structured, students need to have many opportunities to formulate a reading of the text and to develop language around communicating that reading to others. This means striking a balance between the teacher providing guides and prompts and leads towards an interpretation and the student having the space to add their own ideas. As I was setting out my career in English teaching, I was worried about imposing my interpretation of a text on my students. However, I quickly realised that students need a sense from you that you have some ideas and points of focus to organise the class's approach to the text. I've come to think of this process as being a leading reader, and a bit like the unfinished circle in the background of this slide, the imperfect circle. I provide some frames and leads with which to give students a context in which they may formulate a reading of the text with the help from the teacher and other students. So in a way, you provide an imperfect circle and they close the circle and perfect the circle with their own work with the texts. During the reading of the text and afterwards, you can pose questions that prompt rich discussion as a way of starting this interpretive process. One of the ways in which you can do this is pointing to the imponderables of a text. Some examples from a study of Macbeth. Macbeth knows all the reasons why he should not kill Duncan. He lists them in a soliloquy and decides against the murder before Lady Macbeth talks to him. If he knows why the deed is evil and that it will not give him what he wants in life, why does he do it anyway? Lady Macbeth chides him that he is cowardly, but he has just come from battle decorated for bravery. Why doesn't Macbeth just rebut Lady Macbeth's arguments and attacks on his manhood by reminding her of this? Lady Macbeth claims she knows what it is like to nurse a baby, but the Macbeths have no children. What has happened to that babe? Does this give us any insights into the Macbeths? Just after Macbeth has killed King Duncan, he is freaked out, while Lady Macbeth seems really cool and collected. She even tells him off, accusing him of being infirm of purpose. But she is the one who goes mad at the end of the play and commits suicide. Why do you think this happens? Why is she the one who cracks? Open-ended questions such as these, which there are a number of possible responses and perspectives, help students deepen their initial reading of a text and provide for class discussion. It is a good idea to develop and draft questions such as these as part of your lesson planning in your text response study. Another principle you can use in student work with text is having them show an understanding of a text by transforming it into another kind of text. This is an example again from the study of tragic plays. I've mentioned this example before in workshops. In this case, students needed to complete a comparative literary analysis on at least 2 texts they had studied in exam conditions. So this is what they were working towards in their study of Macbeth, among other plays. In the case of this class, they had studied Macbeth, Death of a Salesman, and A Streetcar Named Desire. All 3 plays used elements of tragedy. Students needed to be able to compare and contrast this aspect of the texts in response in the exam. For this purpose, they needed to synthesise their understanding of tragedy as a form of play. And to do this, I asked them to use their knowledge of recipes to compose a how to cook a tragedy recipe as a group writing task. And I've included the instructions to that task as a Word document embedded into the slides for this lecture, which you're welcome to have a look at. The lecture slides will be made available on Moodle. So these are some of the things that the students came up with. And you can see their humour and synthesising of ideas in this activity. So they've got Guide to Success for Tragedy. So amongst the things they've written is take 1 whole free-range protagonist, half a cup of ambition, a sprinkle of chilli, 3 cups of sickly sweet success, 2 tablespoons of sticky situation brand honey, fatal flaw flour, eggs of insight, drizzle of complexity and hubris, sesame seeds of doubt, and a handful of chorus. Another group came out with chocolate hearts, protagonist, fortune, chorus, hubris, fatal flaw, hamartia, high social status, and success. Mix protagonist with hubris and high social status in a bowl, gradually add good fortune and hamartia, sprinkle success, beat with electric beater until the climax reaches a stiff peak, overbeat until stiff, peak falls into the point of no return, bake in the oven until the scent of hubris fills your kitchen and the surface cracks, and so on. So it's evident here that the students have managed to transform their understandings of tragedy that they have drawn from their study of 3 plays into this other text type. Here's another group: tall glass of protagonist, a dash of admiration, 1 mouldy choice, 2 cups of extra hot downfall sauce. This was a very humorous task for them. They showed a lot of verve and wit in this task. And we copied this, and they all got copies of each other's tragedy recipe to draw on in writing up their assignments in preparation for the exam. Before you're asking your students to write an essay on a text, then they need many opportunities to explore their ideas about the text and formulate some of their own responses to the text. Thinking of writing as connected to other modes is a way of going about planning your activities to support students in developing a reading of the text. The activity you see here on this slide was to design a set and costumes for an act in a play we were studying, The Cherry Orchard by Anton Chekhov. This requires students to collaboratively or independently design the set and costumes using our reading of the play and their prior work with it to imagine how it could be translated to the stage. Students, upon completion of this design, gave a brief oral presentation about it where they explained their rationale with reference to the text. So sometimes developing a reading of the text involves other media, including visual media, to help students build up a common understanding. Towards this, it's worth thinking about Stanley Fisher's ideal of an interpretive community. This is an ideal that admittedly can be difficult to achieve with some English classes, but it continues to be an ideal for many English teachers. It's the idea that through reading, talking, arguing, doing role plays, doing inquiry and research, drawing, writing, listening, viewing, students build up a shared understanding of the text under study. Fisher's idea proposes that we draw on each other's ideas and perspectives in developing our reading of a text and our response to it. And some of the best work comes out of productive disagreements amongst students. Rob Pope writes about textual interventions and having students think about how they would transform the text into another medium. And this is a powerful way of thinking about how they might intervene in a text and develop a close reading of it. This is another idea for building up an interpretive community. In this case, it was part of, again, the IB course, where students had to read some texts that had been translated into English from another language and another culture and time. One of those texts was Out Stealing Horses by Per Pedersen, but it really doesn't matter in this case which text we were using. The principle was that students had engaged with the text and its cultural and historical setting and its some of the language implications of it being translated, and we talked about how it could be adapted for film. Students, as part of this course, had to do what's called an interactive oral on at least one of the texts in the literature and translation part of the course. So this interactive oral was a film hour feature show about the making of a fictional adaptation of Out Stealing Horses. Incidentally, there has now been a real film adaptation of Out Stealing Horses, which you should track down because it's a beautiful Norwegian film. So students took different roles. They were location scouts, casting scouts, screenwriters. They had someone play the author and his opinion on the adaptation. And they did a making of film feature, sort of entertainment show, slice of life. And they presented this to the class, the group that were doing this, and the class then interacted and asked questions. This was working towards a summative assessment where the students wrote an assignment on a topic of their own devising on the novel or text that they did their interactive oral on. And the student needed to show an awareness of the cultural and historical context of the text. So it's a few examples of how students can engage with text in a variety of ways to build up that interpretation of a text. Just want to link to some ideas that you may have come across in other units about VYGOTSKY'S zone of proximal development. So as you're helping students work with the text in various ways and build up an interpretation, you're moving them towards being able to write about it in a summative way. You will have come across VYGOTSKY'S concept of the ZPD or the ZPD in other units, and it's often used to plan units of work where the student is required to write an essay for assessment at the end of a topic. Now, how does this really work in practice? The idea is that we provide opportunities for students and scaffold them to move to the next level of their achievement. We can't make things too easy, otherwise there's not enough challenge. We can't make things too hard, otherwise students find it's too much of a stretch and they can't get any sense of achievement. Yandel mentions this in his essay. Scaffolding refers to a process that enables pupils to solve a problem or carry out a task which would be beyond their unassisted efforts. And he writes about Monica's class in Inner London, where she uses open questions about the use of violence and role plays to provide opportunities for students to construct interpretations of Julius Caesar as a set text. So he's looking at that zone of proximal development idea, but also some of the limitations of that idea. So this concept of scaffolding, I want to explore further with reference to a unit I taught in Year 12 on the film On the Waterfront, which has Marlon Brando playing the lead character. I'm going to briefly sketch a few aspects of scaffolding on this film unit. One of the first things that I want to point out is that it's important to have in your own mind a bit of a hook or a frame that you're going to use as a focaliser for your initial setup of the unit. It helps students organise their approach to the text, but it doesn't have to determine what the meaning, the interpretation that they make of the text. So in this case, I use the idea that the main character in this film, a character called Terry, is engaged in a moral journey, and that there are two other characters, Edie and Father Barry, who are also engaged in a moral journey in this film. And they go from being complicit with a corrupt union and a code of silence to breaking that code and speaking out against corruption. So that's the course of the film, the journey they make. Prior to teaching the text, a teacher needs to have read and viewed it and worked out some key questions and a hook with which to organise the approach to the text. There needs to be a balance between the frame offered by you as a teacher and the space for students to use this frame to go on their own journey of working out what the text means to them. So in this case, the idea of the road to redemption and moral journeys of the characters was the frame or the hook, but within that, students developed their own take on what that meant. As students are developing their interpretation of the text, you start to move them towards writing a text response essay. You will need to be generating practice essay topics. These should emerge from the work you've done with your class to build knowledge of the text and to develop readings of the text. This is where your talk with other teachers who are teaching the same text is really important, as well as your own thinking, reflection, and research about the text. Practice topics should emerge from the hook or focalising ideas you've been working with your students. So here's a sample topic from that unit that I was working with the Year 12s. This is a quote from the character Terry. "I was ratting on myself all those years and I didn't even know it. I'm glad what I'd done to you." On the Waterfront suggests that it is more important for an individual to obey their conscience than to conform to group expectations. Discuss. So this is a practice topic that was offered to students that we then worked with and broke down and pulled apart in class with the topic on the board. And we developed some ideas about our responses to that topic. Then you might move from that to some modelled writing and some joint construction of writing. So one of the most powerful things you can do in the writing process is to model that writing process with your students. This can take many forms, such as providing them with an essay introduction, such as what you have here on this slide, or sample body paragraphs, or whole essays for them to see what a finished product looks like. You can also do this on the board or project it on a screen during writing time in your classroom. You can do a think aloud and compose a sample paragraph on the board, explaining to students what you're thinking about as a writer as you're composing that, and doing crossing out, recomposing sentences, thinking about different places to put key points. So you're talking to them about what you're thinking. So you're making explicit the thinking you're doing as you're composing an essay. Joint construction can also be used, and this is where you compose a paragraph on the board with input from the students. So this is where you can model using more sophisticated vocabulary, using evidence by posing questions, such as what would be a good quote to use here? What's another way of saying doing the right thing? Rephrase student responses by incorporating some of their language while also adding some sharper adjectives or nouns, and that will help them with their writing. And you might want to pause at this point and have a read of this sample introduction, and the resources associated with this unit will be made available on Moodle. At this point, you pass the baton to students by providing them with a scaffold to follow in writing the next paragraph. The ideas should make sense to the students. It should be recognisable to them that these are ideas that have emerged from the work you've done around the text in class. It should be an authentic link between what's happening in the scaffold and what's been discussed in class. This is a very detailed scaffold. So this is an example of an excerpt from a scaffold that was provided for an entire essay, for which this is the introduction, and this is the first body paragraph. And so here you can see that there's quite a lot of support offered to students at this point. and there's a lot of evidence already provided to students. And they need to more or less recreate this scaffold in a full essay. So modelled writing, joint construction and scaffolded plans are an important part of your teaching repertoire in helping them move towards sophisticated essay writing. However, there are pitfalls to this. This is what I call extreme scaffolding, and it points to one of the paradoxes or tensions that I've found in teaching senior English. The idea behind scaffolding, pardon me, is that students become more independent in their writing. In my years teaching senior English, I did come across a phenomenon that I'll call the scaffolding paradox. The theory of scaffolding is that the teacher gradually hands over responsibility for composing the text to the student, who gets to the point where they can write independently, having internalised the discourse of essay writing. However, for a significant number of students, the opposite seems to happen. The more scaffolding you provide, the more they want, until essay writing becomes a matter of following detailed instructions to the letter. So you will need to follow your own sense of what's right in supporting your students, while also helping them formulate their own ideas in response to texts. Also, keep in mind that some students outgrow the TEAL format, topic, sentence, evidence, explanation, link. And they should be encouraged to treat writing as a sense-making, problem-solving activity where they are starting to work out the best approach to their paragraphs for themselves. These students, the ones who outgrow TEAL, are ill-served by a rigid insistence that they stick to TEAL, as they are capable of coming up with less formulaic, fresh responses that delight examiners. So if you have one of those students, it's time to take the scaffold off with them and help to move them to the next stage so they can begin to develop an even more independent voice. So this is one of those tensions that you'll find in practice. And there's a link there if you can explore from the slides to the opening of the Lego movie, the first Lego movie, which parodies this approach to life, that there are instructions for the one way of doing something. And if we just follow the instructions, all will be just spiffy. And it's not quite as simple as that. So there are methods you can use: sample essay topics, deconstructing the essay topic, modelled writing, joint construction, and then plans, heavily scaffolded plans. But there'll always be ways in which you're tinkering with that and adjusting it and fine-tuning it for the students you have in your class, and trying to get some students to move beyond that in their writing. Students themselves can see the tension between the need to follow recognisable structures and the need to have their own voice and a personal understanding of the text that feels authentic. It is striking in these quotes from students that their sense of what is going on in senior English is an echo of the examiner's comments that we looked at earlier. So these are some sample comments when I asked for some students to write to me about what they thought English teachers should know about essay writing, what it's like for them to learn essay writing. And these are some of the things they had to say. I wish teachers would tell us what to write in the conclusion. When they teach the essay, they always run out of time before assessment, and they never get to tell us what to say in the conclusion. So this is a student who wants to be told what to say in the conclusion. So there's quite a number of these students. This is where the scaffolding paradox comes from. Teachers teach structures and topic sentences and body paragraphs, but in the end, everyone has to find their own way to do it. So this is a contrasting perspective from another student. If there is a lack of understanding of the text, the confidence in being able to write and explain the given text becomes less and less. So the importance of having a solid sense of what the text is about and having ideas is really important. I think that it's a strange relationship between being thoughtful and being right in an essay. So often it's probably better to play it safe and stick to being impersonal. This student has gauged the environment she's working in. It was a girl. And she's decided that there's a system here, there's a game here she's playing, and it's better to play it safe. The last comment is, I believe that it's important to provide concrete foundations that allow for the student's own voice to come through, but while simultaneously following a structured essay pattern. This student has more or less said what I'm saying in this lecture. Students are pretty savvy. If we ask them what they think is going on, often they have some pretty insightful things to say about the process of being a senior English student. So this is the tensions we're navigating in our practice. There needs to be some time set aside for explicitly teaching language that helps students discuss the literary features of texts. You'll see here a slide with verbs for talking about what a text is doing. This means, of course, that the meta-language for literary and filmic devices is part of your teaching, but it also means having other linguistic resources, such as using verbs to write about what a text is doing to suggest meaning to a reader or viewer. And you could explicitly teach this and provide sentence stems and vocabulary towards the end, when students are formulating their responses, to help them build up the repertoire to express their ideas. A lot of this is about apprenticing students to being novice literary critics. There's a specialised literacy in senior English to do with responding to texts, and we need to be able to teach students explicitly the discourse, the linguistic features and the language of literary criticism so that our students can succeed on this point. Most text response essay assessment criteria have some elements that assess a student's ability to analyse how a text is put together and how the form of the text suggests the meaning of the text. Language for talking about texts in this way needs to be taught explicitly, and students need opportunities to work this language into their vocabulary. This needs to be more effective once students have had time and scope to respond to the text as a reader or viewer and develop a personal response to the text. They are then in a position to develop the language for writing about the formal features of a text as they suggest meaning. This process emerges from a variety of activities such as exploratory talk, role plays, visual responses, textual interventions and transformations, and so on. And I've said to my students in the past, really all reading and responding essay questions, regardless of their wording, require the student to have developed an answer to the following questions. What is the text saying? How is it saying it? Why is it saying it? What argument or point motivates the text? And that can include the historical and social circumstances the text is addressing. And there's some documents there which I'll make available of ways in which I've supported students moving towards using that language in their essays. Finally, as much as possible, develop a shared language with your students about feedback on written work. Here are two images of how this can be done with senior students. On the left, a student called Alicia used to draw me a cat that showed how she felt about the work, and she would then offer a reflection and tell me what she wanted feedback on. So she's written, I thought I was going quite off topic on this. Should I have perhaps focused more on how the audience feels? So she's asking for feedback on that. The image on the right shows another student using post-it notes attached to different parts of her practice essays. She would write down what she was trying to do in that part of the essay and what she wanted feedback on. This process can be built in with conferences with students about their work and helps them feel like you are in a conversation with them about their writing. One of the strengths of this approach is that the student's purpose with the writing is at the forefront. It's what they are trying to say about the text that is the point of departure for any discussions. It becomes a starting point for your feedback to that student. A couple of quotes to summarise. One of the additional readings in this part of the unit talks about negotiating meanings. Some key quotes from John Schmidt's essay. Development of writing at school implies learning to negotiate the voices and roles offered by the genres of school writing. So this process of trying to work out how to make it your own is part of developing a writing voice. Writers adopt and negotiate social discourse roles available to them in the genres of school writing, and social interaction between actual participants in particular classrooms is seen as participation also in the larger world of values and discourses. Writing development is a personal negotiation of cultural genres and values. This brings us back to the point at the start that essay writing may seem to have nothing much to do with what's going on in the world, but it actually does if we think about the processes and practices we're asking our students to engage with in developing a voice and a take on the world and an interpretation of a text. The risks, though, of going down a strictly formulaic path are that as soon as the curriculum changes, it's almost as if what you've been doing has become totally irrelevant. This danger is signalled by Victorian scholar Carol Emerson when she writes, "In reciting, the language of others is authoritative, it is distanced, taboo, and there can be no play with the framing context. One cannot even entertain the possibility of doubting it, so one cannot enter into dialogue with it. To change a word in a recitation is to make a mistake. The power of this kind of language, however, has its corresponding cost. Once discredited, it becomes a relic, a dead thing. One makes a self through the words one has learned, fashions one's own voice in inner speech by selective appropriation of the voices of others." This is a fascinating idea. It's not that we don't teach structure, it's not that we don't teach language and discourses of literary criticism, but we do so in a way that there's some negotiation going on where the student must be allowed to work out how they can fashion it in a way that feels authentic for them. And we in turn are also working out ways we can teach that feel authentic to us. So to summarise, essay writing for school and beyond. Back to the key ideas. Negotiation. Think about where you're calling from. Gauge your situation as a teacher and your student situation, where you're at. There's always curriculum and assessment that frames your practice, and you need to be savvy about that and work with that. That's a reality of your practice. Interpretation is central, the process of making meaning with and around texts and having students experience that process for themselves with your help and leadership. Building meaning is important. Orientations to the text and writing, pre-writing activities, work around the text that aren't necessarily verbal, such as making posters, role plays, movie adaptations. Build knowledge of the text and construct understandings with rich discussion and powerful exploratory talk. Teach discourse conventions and academic language through scaffolding, and develop a shared language of feedback around the learning and the writing you're doing with students, and help them see themselves ultimately as readers and writers in their own right. Thank you for your attention. These are some references if you want to look up any of those.